I'm really glad to be here, actually. Professionally, I'm a technical evangelist at a company called Combel. And some of you might know me from the PHP Benelux community, where I run the user group with a bunch of people. Maybe some household notes. If you really want to follow me on Twitter, there is a possibility. That's the handle, so would be most welcome. The mandatory commercial slide, of course. I work at a hosting company in Belgium. I think our business is similar to the previous presentation from KPN, but I only have good things to say. There are some minor issues every company has, but I'm really glad to be working there. We're your mainstream hosting company, so we offer everything, and that's the way I put it, from your 99 euros per year up to your 99,000 euros per year. So we're located in Belgium, which is right next to Holland, so we don't really compete with the guys you just saw. We're just doing our own thing. Maybe before we actually start the presentation, I have to add some context to all of this. So I was planning to come because I attended Velocity, and I noticed there was this Varnish user group meeting, which I was absolutely thrilled about. So I said, okay, I'm going to sign up. I'm going to go there. I'm going to learn some new stuff. And then Ruben contacted me and said, well, would you mind doing a presentation? And then I got a bit freaked out. And I said, I'm going to a Varnish, a hardcore Varnish group of people. And I'm going to talk about Varnish from a hoster's perspective. So let's hope that turns out well. So I told Ruben, well, I do my Varnish. I can do some stuff, but this is not going to be so in depth, so detailed. And he said, that's exactly what he said. He said, you'll be fine. Just present some challenges you face at your company. So I said, okay, let's try it out. So we all use Varnish, right? Can I see some hands, some nodding, some yes, nice. Who is not using Varnish currently? Congratulations, sir. Congrats. And because we need to know this before we can continue, so we can dynamically adapt the presentation to the audience we have. So we all know how to install it? Yes? Yes? Okay, I see nodding. That's good. Do we know how to configure it? I hear some moaning. And we know how to work with VCL. That's an important one. Who does not work with VCL? It's okay. We're polite people. So, okay, we have our hardcore Varnish crowd. For those who have no clue what I'm talking about, let's do a very quick 1-minute reminder. I'm more of an Ubuntu Debian kind of guy, so the cool thing is we use Varnish 3 in production, and I always advise our people, our system administrator, to use your repo, use the Varnish repo to download it, and it's been very successful. I think the last 10 implementations I've done have all been on Varnish 3. Installing and configuring is pretty simple. If you're using a Ubuntu or Debian system, go to etc default Varnish and tweak some parameters. So, but we can do this pretty fast because you all know your stuff, right? There's a thing called backends, and I'm still using Apache for this one, but there's a variety of web servers on which you can connect it. We even have a setup including IIS, so pretty cool. Change the port to another port, preferably, and set up your backend in etc varnish default.vcl. That is the bare minimum you should do to have it up and running. Will it be successful? I'm not pretty sure, but it will do something. Now, as far as VCL goes, this is a snippet. This is the Varnish default setup. I have a story about that coming up in a couple of minutes, but this is how Varnish behaves internally. Not actually using these pieces of VCL, because you see they're all commented out, but this is mainly the way you should be dealing with your VCL. This is some more stuff. Now, I will talk about following some rules or not following some rules. And there aren't really explicit rules, but there's a bunch of guidelines, implicit guidelines, that would be good. If I would have an army of developers sitting here not really knowing what to do, I would explain them this. Use appropriate cache control headers yourself. We don't want to make our VCL really fat, because in a lot of cases, who has really fat VCLs containing lots of application logic? I do sometimes. Well, if we could educate developers to do this themselves, use good cache control headers, preferably use smaxh internally. Do we use, who uses smaxh or advocates smaxh? Good stuff. There's this thing called ESI, which we all know about. We can do that really hardcore static. So if rec.url equals this or that, then we do ESI. I actually prefer surrogate capability and surrogate control headers for that. I see some enthusiastic nodding there, so I believe people agree with me on that. And please, please, please avoid using cookies at all. And I hate cookies. And I saw Paul Henning talk about HTTP2 possibly removing cookies, possibly between codes. I really hope that happens because cookies, from my perspective, it's always a mess. But you'll see when we get there. And I recently learned about the vary headers, which I really, really like. So I'll be talking about that a bit. And only cache get and head. And when I do these kind of talks, I do lots of Varnish talks, but to a developer audience. And I always say, well, why should you only do get and head and not post? And then they say, well, it changes application state and blah, blah, blah. So we all agree on that. And use consistent URLs, because not everyone does that. Not everyone has a unique URL for a set of data. Now, you all get this, right? Can I see some nodding? Yes, thank you. But a lot of people absolutely have no clue what they're dealing with. And as a hosting provider, we need to guide them, slightly guide them. We also have people who are very knowledgeable about this, but they just don't give a shit. They just say, well, it works on my machine. And then I start facepalming, because we hear that all the time. It works on my machine. But to actually be able to understand Varnish really well, I think everyone should know the HTTP spec. I don't know it by heart. I had a good friend advising me for my next holiday when I sit at a really nice sandy beach under sunny circumstances. I should read the entire HTTP spec. And actually true, because a really smart person once said to me, you can only be fully responsible and fully responsibly use a piece of software or a piece of equipment in general when you understand the underlying components. So if we don't understand HTTP, we might as well figure out something else and find other jobs. Now, I heard some really good things about, you had the BBC, you had KPN, I heard some other stories about people successfully implementing Varnish. Now, I work in the hosting industry, and we don't really get to choose the code we work on. So I think the guys here at the BBC, they have a nice piece of code, they work with it, they optimize where necessary. We don't get to choose. We get the really good developers who know their stuff. We do conf calls with them, we set up some meetings, we agree on things, and it works. And then we have people who have no clue. So what we essentially do is this. I'm not going to name what's happening here, but you kind of get the idea. Now, I worked my way around Varnish, and I learned a couple of things really the hard way. More recently, I learned what is up there above. There is this thing called default behavior, and it doesn't get always executed. It gets executed as long as you leave the VCL hook to do the remainder. If you return, things stop. So once upon a time, not so very long ago, I specifically mentioned to a customer, well, if Varnish sees a set cookie, it will not cache. And he said, great, great, let's do it. Up until the moment I got the phone call saying, well, we have 100,000 visitors right now, and people are seeing each other's shopping basket. What's happening? And then I went on to IRC, and maybe some very smart people in the Varnish community told me, have a look at the defaults and work your way around those. And I noticed, oh, damn, so if I do return lookup or return pass in the beginning of my custom VCL receive, bad things are going to happen. So I learned this the hard way. So set cookie, max age, post, it all got cached. So what I learned is not to return unless I'm pretty sure what I did there summarizes the entire idea. If you throw no cache headers around, Varnish will still cache. That I learned the hard way. It will only look at the max age. So if your max age is smaller or equal to 0, it will not cache. So people tossing around no cache headers, nothing will happen. And purging, well, I learned that one, I think 2 weeks ago. I set up a custom VCL hash that includes a country cookie. So every visitor, depending on the country he originates from, has this cookie in it, has its own hash. So we have language or country-specific content. Well, if you do a regular purge on it, nothing will happen. So I learned that 2 weeks ago. And I learned that vary could be our friend here to solve these issues, or use the way more powerful ban features that Varnish offers. And I also learned there's a hit for pass cache. So that's pretty good, but unfortunately I learned that the hard way by screwing up some projects which I fixed kind of rapidly. So there's also the out-of-the-box behavior, and if you're trying to offer a Varnish solution more or less as a service, you will figure out a general VCL setup, and you're going to offer it to them and ask them to respect those rules, because that's what this talk is about, respecting the rules. And here we go again with this nice little snippet, and I marked the things that are important to you guys, or to us as a Varnish community. only get and head will be cached. This is default behavior. If you do return pass in the beginning of your own overridden VCL receive, this will not be executed. This is really important. And if there's authorization or if there's a cookie coming in, don't cache either. Again, I learned that the hard way. And then in the end, in the fetching logic, there's a couple of pieces that are happening. The TTL lower or equal than 0, you can really read this there, or a set cookie coming from the backend, or a vary asterisk. So that we learned. Now, just like Paul, we do a lot of Drupal ourselves. I recently started looking out for that community. They have a community as well, a fairly successful community. And it was kind of hard. We have a lot of Drupal sites, and they don't really perform that well. So we had to do some magic there. But the problem is that still a lot of wrong headers are being sent out, and some cookies are being sent out. And I went to the Varnish cache website and found a pretty standard VCL for Drupal. But unfortunately, every Drupal developer has these custom modules that have some real-time data or throw around other cookies. So it isn't always that it's not really always that precise. So Paul, I should talk to you after this session. We should catch up and see where this goes. But I think from what I've seen, I went to DrupalCon events myself. They know Varnish, and it would be advisable if this community could really talk to the other community, make each other better, and come out with some official VCL in the case that hasn't happened yet. That would be really helpful for both me, other people in the hosting industry, or just mainly people setting up Drupal. WordPress is a bit easier with Varnish. So what I did there to prove it to my customers, because and my colleagues as well, they didn't really believe it. So I took the smallest VPS available, 256 megabytes of RAM, installed stock WordPress, installed stock PHP, ran a A/B test on it, and got out an average of between 4 and 5 requests per second on the stock. Then we added a couple of plugins in there for purging, added a good VCL for WordPress, and we got up to 1,600 requests per second. So that really convinced the non-believers. So we do a lot of WordPress, although Drupal still remains one of the most popular CMS systems to be out there and to require Varnish as a caching layer in front of it. We still see a lot of WordPress out there. So those are the good ones. I have 3 ones I would like to talk about. And then we have this little bastard. I see like Alistair sitting here right in front is really an experienced Magento person, and I think we share the same concerns, right? Who uses Magento in here or has come across it? I see some slight disturbance in the audience. Now it's up to you. What happened? I'm seeing some people committing suicide in the audience. So what actually happened with you guys? Speak out loud. I want to share these things.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. What is a mess?
Magento is a mess.
Thank you. But a lot of people use Magento, and there's huge amounts of business in Magento. And I think every shared server we have at least has 2 or 3 Magentos fighting for resources, killing our systems. So if in this wonderful world we live in, could find some people who could make a replacement that offers the same features, we should talk. We should really talk. And then you have your custom code. Now, custom code isn't that bad because in a lot of cases, people control what is out there. And if you ask them to do some slight optimizations, they can do it. Not everyone is that as disciplined with the cookies, with the cache control headers, what happens around the system. But I think in general, it is safe to say that the state or the lack of state is really our enemy in this case. And then we walk up to the entire idea of cookies. And I had a really hard time explaining to some customers and to some colleagues internally that there's 2 kinds of cookies. So you have your request cookie coming in, that is handled by the VCL receive bit, and then we have the response coming from the web server. Now in both cases, we don't really want to cache this, but there are some exceptions. But before we touch that, we should know what we use cookies for. So mainly we use them for sessions. So who actually deals with PHP here? Who's a PHP kind of guy? Well, we all know what sessions are, PHP, SesID, and I think other languages have similar mechanisms to keep sort of track of the state or the identity of the user. What I really hated at first, but now figured out that it wasn't really that hard, was Google Analytics. So I said, okay, we must drop these Google Analytics cookies because they really fuck up everything, but will it make our backend either slow or inconsistent, or will the stats be skewed? And I think it was 2 years ago, I tried it figuring out, and I said, well, if I drop those, will the stats be skewed? And the answer was no, luckily, because there is no piece of HTTP in the back that really deals with these things. It's just JavaScript dealing with it. So your browser reads the UTM-A, UTM-B, cookies, deals with them, sends them over to Google. So if I drop them in the VCL receive, nothing bad will happen, and cacheability will be improved. So we did that, and life was good. We were happy. And then again, as I mentioned, country-specific, language-specific things. I'll have some slides on that. So what do we do about this? When we see cookies, what do we do about this? In the majority of cases, people say nothing because they have no clue how to deal with this. They have no clue if it will affect their application logic. And I have to be honest, if you drop all cookies, it will have a nasty effect on a lot of applications. So we started out by identifying cookies that are present and saying, well, we should remove a couple of cookies. So whenever a customer says, we have a bad performing site or CMS, I ask them, give me all URL patterns and all usage of cookies. That's a hard one. And then it takes them, what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to figure it out. Then we arrange a conf call and talk and go through every single URL pattern. Not every unique URL, that would be impossible, but the patterns, and see what happens, how they deal with cookies. And these are a couple of things we can do. If you're absolutely sure that these cookies are just pollution, let's say there's only the Google Analytics cookie, just unset them all, just remove them. And you could also remove them from the backend. If some backend system starts sending cookies, and you know it's just plain old stale data, static data, and they use PHP session ID or some other session mechanism just for the fun of it, you can remove it in the backend as well. So but I don't need to repeat this to you because you already know this better than I do. There are several kinds of cookies. You have the set cookie, you have the regular cookie. Everyone understands this, yes? There is no confusion about that. Okay, thank you. You can also remove some cookies, which is advisable if you use, let's say, language-specific cookies. The has.js and the underscore cookies, well, just drop them. This is some really cute Rexup Alm magic. I hope there are more simple ways of doing this in the future. If I could request something to contributors. This is kind of hard to grasp, and it takes some time to figure it out. Not everyone is a regular expression wizard. Yes? Is there a VMod? Here we go. Now, in all honesty, I haven't played around with VMods yet. We know they exist. We know they can do good things. And we also know it's a good way to standardize extending default Varnish behavior. So we should talk about this later today or online. We can also ignore cookies. Like this is a good example, or a bad example, actually, so to speak. If you see a get or a head coming, don't analyze behavior or the defaults, just return lookup and just directly go to the backend. I sometimes do that for static sites. And this is the more clever way of doing it, but more complicated. Just add cookies to the hash. So this is that specific piece of code we had in production, slightly modified, not to reveal who's actually the customer. If in the cookie string, there is a thing called lang. Well, we're dealing with the language, obviously, and or if it's not set, just pass it because the backend needs to identify the user. There needs to be a cookie that has to be set. If it's present, well, continue following the rules that Varnish states, and then go to VCL hash, detect it, replace it in the hash, and make sure only. And I have to run to my. I have no mic right now, so I'll be silent. So this is the actual piece you're going to put in your hash. And if you run Varnish log, you'll see that besides the regular URL or IP you're running, the URL itself, and then the extended piece, you'll see that NL, FR, EN, whatever language you use is going to be stored in there, and that's going to be our hash. I learned some nasty things about that, about purging as well, but as explained, this is not going to get purged or banned by default. You should add some logic in your hit and miss. But in a lot of cases, you have to go to the drawing boards with the customer. It's not always black or white. There are several shades of gray we encounter. This is a pretty ugly, I admit, pretty ugly piece of VCL we gotten from a customer we needed to adapt. So there's so much rules in there. It's so fat, and this is the actual code we use. This is a piece of VCL receive we use. This is a modified, fully tweaked WordPress. So they use WordPress for some basics, and then all the rest is custom written. And you see, this is no fun maintaining. And if we would offer Varnish as an actual service to customers, this would be impossible to manage. So again, there needs to be rules. This is a very German thing of me to say. There needs to be rules, and people need to follow it. So I think we should all evangelize and make sure people use the right cache control headers. Now, I wonder, to those who are also in the CMS communities, are there plugins out there that actually sanitize output headers? Let's say Drupal. Are there plugins out there that do this, that sanitize HTTP headers, make sure whatever you send will be cached properly by no matter what reverse proxy?
There must be a module for that.
There must be a module for that. Standard answer from a Drupalist, I'm sorry. So we should figure that out. We have more of that stuff, replacing cookies, and in the end, you're reading a 10-screen VCL, and I really, really hate it. But sometimes it's the only way of doing things, and development time costs money. I think it would be cheaper to set up a specific VCL for that customer instead of just asking, well, rewrite this piece of code, do this, do that, do something else. Now, what I learned as well, in all honesty, I learned that last week, that there's this thing called the vary header. I really like it. I like to be honest about this. I know a bit of Varnish. I know enough Varnish to help the majority of the customers, but this was something fairly new I learned, and I really enjoyed it. Now, we all know vary. We know what it does. Who doesn't know it? Up until last week, I knew that there was this thing called vary, but I had no clue what it did. Well, you remember that language-specific thing? Well, you shouldn't touch your VCL hash on that. Just change VCL receive so all unnecessary cookies are dropped, and then you can say vary cookie, and it will work. But don't mess with other cookies. Don't add other cookies. Drop the analytics cookies if you can, but that will work. If there is a language cookie, Varnish will respect it. If you do the standard purge, Varnish will respect it.
There's actually a better way is to add a new header that you copy the country coding to say X country.
Yeah.
And then vary on X country instead of.
That is actually the best way of doing things, because in that way you are sure that no other cookies get injected in there. So that's a good idea. It requires a bit more VCL, but I'll definitely have a look at it. But in some cases, that was the quickest way of helping out the customer.
It's a really bad idea, because then IE stops caching locally.
If you drop them, if you do vary.
If EI, any version, sees a vary header which is not user agent or content type, you just stop and throw away its local cache.
Whoops.
Because we didn't address that.
Okay.
You can strip that vary and deliver.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
So
you put it on and then you remove it again.
But in the end, if we have to do this, it would be better to just implement your ID, because we're modifying the VCL anyway. So what we've learned today is, if you want to use vary, use it with a custom header, because you can't always trust what the cookie does. We have more stuff. We'll need to skip that because I'm short on time. Am I, Hildur? I think I have about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So, and then we run up to the issue of SSL. And I remember doing a talk at a conference, and people asked us, well, what do you do with HTTPS? And we said nothing, absolutely nothing, because we had no use cases of people using SSL, HTTPS in an environment. But then we had a big customer doing online sales, and they wanted HTTPS, so this is what we use. We use Nginx, put it in front of it, because it's way cheaper than buying the big, expensive load balancer that does this. So we used Nginx for it. We terminated the HTTPS traffic and just passed it along as HTTP. Now, we had to make some decisions there, because you'll have a load balancer, or first you have Nginx, and then you'll proxy through to Varnish, and then you'll go to the web server. There's a lot of hubs there. So what we, for some projects, decided is keep the SSL traffic on Nginx and do reverse proxying on Nginx. It has a bit of caching in there as well, because we figured out that the majority of the traffic actually goes through HTTP and not HTTPS. So in that way, we said, well, it's worth it just splitting them up and adding some caching logic to Nginx. So it's not all about Varnish. Sometimes we say, well, we'll put this in Varnish and something else in Nginx. Now, I've been fairly negative about developers. I'm a developer myself, or pretend to be, but there is hope. There is hope, luckily. And there's this thing I call, with a catchy phrase, called devolution. Not evolution, but devolution. Developers are evolving, and I know this because I run a user group, and we see people becoming more professional. When we do pre-sales trajectories with customers, we see that the developers out there actually know their stuff. And this is what I have to say about this. There are better frameworks out there, and I think that applies to all languages, specifically to PHP. We're picking up the pace, becoming more professional, being aware that you should leverage HTTP as good as you can. Just not throw it out there. Don't print out your stuff regularly. Control your headers. Know what's going to be out there. Play around with it. CMS framework adoption. Well, a big thing that I got enthused about was the fact that Drupal is going to use Symfony 2 components in the next release. And I really know that Symfony is very strict about its HTTP discipline. So that's going to be good. And if other systems, regardless of the language, are going to pick that up, we're going to have some good systems in the future. And the VCLs are going to get thinner and thinner because the application is disciplined enough to manage the cacheability himself. And yes, we have smarter developers. And a thing I really like is the fact that there's a movement called DevOps that really bridges gaps between code and infrastructure. Last pieces here, last pieces of slides. The good thing is that a lot of people start using page cache themselves and encounter the trivial issues that we run into with Varnish ourselves. The fact that if something needs to be on there real time, you need to find some trickery to do it, or use ESI or other mechanisms to divide your blocks and make sure that you have good cacheability, but in the end also have decent refresh times. So these people know about stale data. They know what stale data is, and most of them use this piece of technology. They use Ajax for that, and that works in a lot of cases. Other people use ESI. I have to be honest, we have 0 customers using ESI, despite all my efforts to evangelize ESI as a valid technology. And for those who do, and this is cool, some frameworks I use, some PHP frameworks I use, have a reverse proxy built in. So it mimics not really Varnish behavior, but just ESI. And people can use surrogate capability and surrogate control. So for those unaware of these headers, they're in the HTTP spec, and if you send a surrogate capability header from your Varnish to the backend, Varnish announces that it can actually use ESI, but you have to mention ESI specifically in the header. And then the application detects it and says, well, okay, I'm talking to this proxy here who understands surrogates, so ESI in this case. I will send something back to him and say, well, I have surrogate control. And then Varnish interprets that and says, oh, yeah, so I speak ESI, he understands ESI, let's do this. And then you do ESI. So that's a good way of making your VCLs thinner and put the logic at the application side. Now, the very last thing I would like to say is that we encounter, and this is a really good case for Varnish, cases where people say, well, we have this big fat CDN, we pay a humongous amount of money for it, and the only feature we need is caching. We're only located in country X, Y, or Z, and we're paying so much money. And then I said, well, maybe you could consider using Varnish instead, and it's been a great success. Now, the most remarkable case in which we used Varnish was a site completely built in .NET with SQL Server, IIS, the whole thing. And we evangelized a hybrid setup. We evangelized the fact that there's this open source technology out there that we run on Linux systems. We're not enemies, we're good friends, it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be better. And he had a really hard time convincing his CIO. But in the end, we made it, we implemented it, and now we're very good friends and we can't do anything wrong to them. So we actually consider replacing a CDN if you're not using the GeoIP features. And that's a good thing, and that's the way I would like to end my presentation, that Varnish fits in pretty nicely into a lot of cases. What does the future hold for Varnish? Well, that's what I'm here to learn, and all of you, I guess. I've seen that there's a sort of roadmap talk or the state of Varnish, of releases. I'm really excited about that one. Regarding my own future, well, I'll stick around. I'll try to be as much Varnish user groups as possible, learn from you people. I learned some valid stuff right now about the Vari header, about cookies. And I, for my company, would like to try out, to figure out a way to offer Varnish as a service, not really as a configurable piece of software, no, as a service that you could just put it in front of your web nodes. We're talking about shared hosting here, offering it on a shared hosting solution. Offering a plain old VCL that works for the majority of the cases and have a nice GUI in which people can do click, add rules. That would be very nice. So that is my goal for 2013, building such a system. And well, maybe we should talk, and if anyone else needs this kind of functionality, we should figure out something. I would like to thank you for being here. Thanks to Ruben for putting me out here, and I hope we have a great day. Thanks a lot.